Welcome to Nobel Prize Conversations and this Encore presentation of our April 2014 talk with chemistry laureate Mario Molina. I'm Claire Brilliant and I'm here with our host Adam Smith. Hi Adam.
Hi Claire.
With 1995 chemistry laureate Mario Molina, we wrap up our series of 6 classic podcasts.
And hasn't it been interesting to hear this variety of podcasts from the past? Some of them are completely timeless, but others seem to have aged considerably in 10 years.
And how is it to listen to yourself now, 10 years later?
Well, maybe I'm one of the things that hasn't aged so well over the 10 years. It's strange because you sort of think you're the same. You don't change. But actually, when you listen to yourself and the questions you ask, you think, gosh, things are a bit different. It was the past is a different country, as L.P. Hartley said in The Go-Between. and it really can bring it home.
Mm. And when you spoke to Mario in 2014, he'd already been living with the prize for nearly 20 years. And he'd really embraced a role as a leader in communicating about climate change. In this episode, you spend quite a lot of time talking about a 2014 paper called What We Know. And then you and I actually had the privilege of meeting Mario when we attended an event with him in 2018. I was really struck by his positivity despite some of the enormous challenges posed by climate change.
He was extremely good, wasn't he, at getting that optimism across. In 2018, I remember, audiences had become more worried about climate change than they were back in 2014 when we recorded this. But they seemed to come out of his talks more optimistic than they were when they went in, which is an incredible achievement.
He was talking about such a difficult and I guess, to most people scary subject, but somehow you came out with a message of hope. And I think that does come across in this interview as well. Sadly, Mario Molina is no longer with us as he died in 2020. But do you think the messages from this podcast are still relevant today?
The world doesn't see many people like Mario Molina with such optimism and the engaging power to convince people to come together. I really think that for that reason, this podcast stands the test of time and deserves another listen. It's really worth taking seriously what Mario Molina has to say. So let's listen to this Encore presentation, the last in our series, with Mario Molina. Hello? To start out, so you have just released from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science this new report called What We Know, which you have chaired.
Right.
And this is another report on global warming. And there have been many reports on global warming, of course. So can you tell me what's the need for this new report?
Yeah, the purpose is not really to issue a new report. It is to communicate with the public at large, particularly in the United States, in a more efficient way, so that we're not seeking to bring the science up to date or anything like that. We're just attempting to have a better communication strategy, highlighting just a few steps, maybe 3, at most 4. And so the report is just a background so that it's documented where this comes from. But the main work to be done will be to somehow or other, through the media and interviews, just to stress briefly these 3 or 4 important points about climate change that we want the public to be aware of.
So it's clarifying the message. It's just trying... It's
clarifying the message. We're working with professional communicators, understanding that we scientists often do not communicate well. So that's the main purpose and difference from other reports.
And so the choice of title is very apposite then. What we know. It's just trying to communicate in simple, straightforward language what is currently understood about global warming. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And what is currently understood? What's the main message?
Well, the main message is that the that there is a very clear consensus among experts, and we quote numbers like more than 97% of climate change experts agree that climate change is taking place, and it is most likely of human origin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the main message. And then a second message is that it's already happening. It's not just something for the end of the century. And the third, perhaps, what is the newer message, if you want, is that we are dealing with risks. We are not necessarily worried mostly about the most likely chain of events, but working with economists in particular, we reached the conclusion that the society should react based on risks, namely that there will be some abrupt changes with very important consequences for society at large, or for many groups, if you want, that the risks that are unacceptable, and even if they are not very likely, if you have something of a 10 or 20% risk or more of real calamities to happen, that should be avoided. And the science is rather uncertain about this, but it certainly this is based on science, on scientific insights and so on, that these changes can indeed happen. And perhaps a fourth and also important message is that we can deal with this. We can do something about this, in contrast to sort of ideas that have been spread out that this would be just incredibly expensive and we cannot stop in any way using fossil fuels. So we believe that's a wrong message. The message is that we can deal with the problem at a reasonable cost, certainly smaller than what it would cost should some of these abrupt changes take place.
That's a hopeful message to end with.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot in there. If we start first of all with this idea of climate change is happening and it is most likely caused by human activity, a lot of people seem to get quite hung up on that most likely piece and say, well, maybe it's something we're doing, or maybe it's something we're not doing. And that seems to stop other action. That, the conversation can in a way stop there. Why do you think everybody's got so excited by this question of whether or not it is truly anthropogenic?
When we elaborate on this, we use metaphors. Okay? So when you drive your car, you wear seat belts and have airbags, and not because you have a certainty that you will crash. Okay? And so there are so many things along these lines. So that prompts society to act. If you have a tumor and your physician tells you, there's only 80% chance that it's cancer, just don't worry about it, go home. It doesn't make any sense to require certainty, but we clarify that indeed that science is, that it's a complex system, and we have a very conservative, if you want, group of scientists behind this report, precisely to be able to document these statements. Okay, there have been lots of exaggerations and unclear statements, precisely because they were worried about people misunderstanding the message, and scientists are just not happy with making statements that are actually not correct. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. So yes, we're very used to dealing with uncertainty in our own lives, and yet on the climate change issue, as I say, there seems to be more scope for the discussion of the importance of that certainty? I mean, you have for instance, you have the well-publicized climate change skeptics who seem to hold a lot of public opinion. I mean, have a lot of public interest in them. That people listen to them, and that's odd in a way.
Sure. Yeah, we of course we're very much aware of that. That's why we want to give out a clear message and as needed, explain it with metaphors. Let me give you even a more striking example is extreme events that we're worried about that, but that's bringing climate change closer to home for many people. Okay, there the metaphor we use is here in the USA for baseball games. It's clear that at some point some of the best-known players were taking some drugs. So there are many more home runs, but you cannot assign any particular home run because somebody took some drugs. All you can say is that the likelihood of having home runs clearly increased, and that's what's happening with extreme events. We cannot attribute any particular one to climate change. So that's even less certain, if you want, but overall the statistics is clear. But the idea that you need certainty is that something we want to explain. And there are so many other examples that society making all sorts of political decisions. There's almost never certainty with health issues as well. Okay, so it's why would one want to have certainty with something so clearly worrisome that it would be so much against society's reasonable way of acting to ignore this threat.
But then, but do you have an answer to the question of why that has become such an issue? Do you know? Have you an understanding of what it is that is stopping people accepting the idea that?
Oh yes, we know that there was a very well financed public media campaign from interest groups, and we also know that there are some partisan issues. It has to do with politics. The issue became polarized, and it's a worry particularly with the Republican Party in the United States that at some point took extreme positions. But see, that those extreme positions they are not questioning whether it's likely or not. They are simply claiming that this is all a hoax and that it's just because the scientists want more money and so on. So that's why in this case we also stress that this is the consensus of experts and also of well-established scientific groups, the national academies, professional societies. So you would have to claim that all of science is corrupt, and that begins to be sort of crazy, given the enormous impact that science has had on our lives. Okay. But yes, that there is a whole range of reasons behind skepticism, okay. And perhaps we can address them all as needed. But the most worrisome one is just perhaps the one that said, it's so uncertain that scientists do not agree. No, that's why that's the first message. Scientists do agree that it's happening, that it's real, and they do agree that it's a big risk. So that's that's the point, perhaps. Yeah, I know it's a challenge. Yeah.
And is it? You mentioned that this is directed particularly at the American public. Is this, and I guess American institutions as well? Is this a particular problem, do you think, for America? Is the acceptance of the evidence harder in America than elsewhere?
Yes, but this of course we no longer elaborate in these documents and so on. But what is clear in terms of assessing what needs to be done about these problems, it's clear that one of the best solutions would be to have an international agreement that would put a price on emissions.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, just stepping back for a moment, we don't prescribe with these reports or messages. They're not prescriptive. They just say, let's put it on the table and let society take it seriously, discuss what to do. But coming back to your question, it's clear that the main bottleneck for this international agreement at the moment is U.S. Congress, because they will certainly not ratify any international agreement dealing with climate change because of the official posture of the Republican Party. That is, of course, without their approval, you cannot ratify an international agreement. And their official posture is that is to deny climate change science. My reasoning is that it's something equivalent to still living in the age of astrology, and so that's unacceptable for any rational society. And I hope for these reasons, if we make the message clear, we should be able to bring rationality to the system. But that's the reason why the United States is particularly worrisome. Its international political arena. We certainly know that countries like China, India, and so on are very important for these agreements as well, but we have indications that they would be willing to move much further ahead in terms of this sort of international agreements than at least than the United States at the moment. Okay, so that's the bottleneck in terms of coming with a real solution to the problem.
That anti-science stance, in this case of the Republican Party, is a very peculiar thing, because I mean, of course, there are I suppose it's partly vested interests causing one to have that policy, but it's also an antagonistic attitude to science itself.
Right.
And that's I mean, it's been pointed out by others that the number of scientists within the political system is extremely small, or perhaps even zero.
Right.
But it's just on the face of it, it just seems ludicrous that one would have an antagonistic attitude towards the practice of science. Right.
Yes, and that's why there's such a strong division, because in fact, some Republicans tend to agree. It's just that they are at the moment compelled to take the party line, okay? And that's beginning to change. There are beginning to be some very important divisions within the Republican Party. The first point. Second point, we work with many Republicans that are not now in Congress, but were in government before, and many of them very much agree with our conclusions. In fact, many important decisions connected with the environmental problems and global environmental problems as well were carried out with Republican administrations. Okay. So one point that we're also bringing forward that appears to appeal to the public in the United States is we've done this before. The United States has been a leader with many environmental issues, and of course, one example is the stratospheric ozone issue that I was involved with, and there it's one global problem has been solved very efficiently with leadership from the United States, from Republicans. So it has happened before.
Sorry to dwell on this question of why people find it hard to just accept that action is needed, but is it also the magnitude of the problem that people just feel completely overwhelmed by?
That's sure. That's why one of the important messages is that yes, it is a challenge, but we are not suggesting sudden and very expensive changes. This has been carefully analyzed again by experts, by economists, and we can certainly deal with it. It's an enormous challenge, but it it's something that, again, is striking, that it's not an enormous cost, because with creativity and with technologies for clean energies being further and further developed, we do have examples of things that are already happening that would bring us to a solution of this problem, or at least a clear indication of the right path. Okay, so we don't have to speculate that this is something that perhaps society could actually deal with. We can cite specific examples.
And then I wanted to move on to this question of risk. You mentioned that there are the kind of the gradual changes that we're already observing, but then you're pointing out that there are a risk of truly catastrophic events ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me more about those.
Okay. Well, one worry we had is for the scientific community to perceive this as alarmist and so on. So that's why we don't even use the word catastrophe in the document. It's very carefully avoided, but it's the equivalent, okay, that you will have extremely damaging events. But the risk is based on science. We have indications of changes in climate in the past, and we have very clear indications that there's more energy in the system now, and so on. So it is not sheer speculation. The existence of risk is based on science, and we are very much aware that it's one of those issues that is hard to communicate to the public because they are often very ill-informed about the nature of risks. Okay? And this is where our work with professional communicators is also very helpful, because they can measure and probe how do people react to these various sorts of statements and what's the normal conception they have about risk. And they don't have a good quantification of risks. Okay, if it's small or large, they often just get confused. So we're again, perhaps through metaphors or so, through examples, we can explain why is it very important for society to take some sort of insurance, if you want. That's one way to explain it to them, for risks that are real, and that's quite reasonable and accepted by people in general, that it is quite acceptable to spend some resources on insurance because it has paid off clearly in the past.
Sure. What's an example of the sort of thing that we're insuring against, do you think?
Okay. Here we're again very careful, and we cite and quote some studies like the National Academy study or some IPCC studies that are actually quite conservative here, but examples would be, say, that the drying up of the Amazon forest, okay, or changes in the ocean circulation. And here a conclusion is the following, that once scientists begin to look very carefully at some of these specific possibilities, they turn out not to be very likely. So the main worry remains surprises. That's why we don't want to give many very specific examples of things to worry about without a statement. Look, yes, once we identify these large releases of methane from permafrost or so, sure, these are all feasible. Those do not seem very likely, but we have so much experience with surprises, even the extreme events, okay, were not quite expected, and they are happening already. So I realize it's a difficult issue to communicate, but again, we want to be very honest and not put on the table issues or possibilities that have already been carefully examined. There are, on the other hand, issues such as the rising sea levels that are happening and happening faster than anticipated, with very clear consequences that are already materializing, because once you have higher sea level, then if you have a bad weather or hurricane storms in coastal areas, they become much more damaging. With even if there's just a relatively small increase in sea level.
Yeah.
But that's one of the main worries, if you want.
Yeah, I can see it's a very difficult situation because, yes, if you elaborate specific risks and they don't come to pass, then people on the other side of the fence will turn around and say, that didn't happen. You see, it's all wrong. And in a way, that's the permanent problem, I suppose, you face, that you're trying to be very measured and precise in what you say, and the people who are arguing against you don't have that limitation, so they can just pull, if they want, anything out of the air and say, look, climate change scientists say that this is going to happen. Well, it's not happening, so it's all wrong, which obviously doesn't hold up as an argument, but it's good as a soundbite.
That's right. But that's why in the end we first of all we make a strong case that the climate is indeed changing, because skeptics until perhaps very recently were claiming that it's actually the climate goes up and down and so on. So that part is clear, and that part there is consensus. But the second point, in some sense, we try to rely on the record and the honesty of that is established in many other areas of the experts, the scientific community, and so on. And if necessary, we can certainly have debates or do whatever is needed with people that claim to be experts on the other side. But for the public in general, we believe we don't need to sort of do the science, the complicated science in great detail. We just need to make the case that the science is clear about the risk.
And so what do you hope the report will achieve? What do you hope will be the result?
The result, we hope, is that the polls will begin to show a shift, which is happening already, okay? But we will push the shift in public opinion. And it's happening already because of extreme events that are people just until recently were, this is just a worry for future generations. It doesn't affect us at all. But there are so many people already being affected that there is a change in perception. But we believe if we, for the first time, if you want, do an organized public relations campaign comparable to the one that was carried out, well-financed and so on, and on the other side, that we will have an impact on public opinion, and hence, subsequently, on the perception of politicians about this, of course, because they count on public opinion often to support their decisions. So we realize that it's not something that's going to happen immediately, but we believe that if a well-carried-out campaign can, in fact, move the results of the poll.
When you compare this problem to the one you worked on earlier, on CFCs and eliminating CFC emissions or reducing them, was the same kind of publicity campaign required for that, or was there just an easier acceptance?
It was easier because, of course, energy is behind so many activities of society that's clearly more difficult and behind economic growth and so on. So we had an easier time with the CFCs, but fortunately we were able to act before it became polarized or politicized. We did not have this division along party lines materializing. We were able to act before that, and public opinion was important, but it was really the opinion of decision makers, leaders in government, that was able to make things sufficiently important to reach an international agreement. Okay? So we were not really counting there on public opinion driving the solution to the problem. But it was certainly part of it. Whoever had looked at it and so on, it supported, and there were, of course, skeptics as well. And another very important difference, if you want, is that we were able to work with industry. At the beginning, they were skeptics, of course, but afterwards, the science became very clear, and so the industrial sector collaborated with us. And by the way, what's happening now with climate change is not that the private sector is against it, it's just some interest groups in the private sector are against it, but some others are in favor. So that's another thing we will try to take advantage of, that we can work with powerful groups as well that understand the problem, and so not all the business-minded people, if you want, think that the problem is a hoax. But again, we clearly had an advantage with the stratospheric ozone issue, in that at some point, essentially all of industry was behind the solution to the problem.
And if you can achieve this change or that you can help to achieve this ongoing change in the public opinion in the States, that's part of the battle. Do you think that in the long term, the combination of a developed world already sort of at high levels of energy usage and an emerging world using more and more energy as time goes on can reach a solution and, in fact, act concertedly to prevent truly damaging global warming?
Yes, that's, of course, a very important question. We believe that it's possible, but it will require further developments in technology, so that the options to use less fossil fuel become also more economically attractive. And that's happening. There is a clear tendency for clean energies to become cheaper. So perhaps 2 points here to make. One is we're very much aware of the need of of a good section of the global population that doesn't have access to energy. That's a high priority also. But at least for the near future, that would not be, even if they were to use fossil fuels or wood or so, that would not detract from the main effort of the rest of the countries. And so we are very willing to promote access to energy for poor populations. Obviously, we're not suggesting that there should be zero emissions and so on. We're just suggesting to do the most efficient way to do it. And by the way, these questions are no longer part of this report, or so. We're suggesting let's put all of this on the table and have experts continue discussing that. But anyhow, the second point is that yes, although there are still some problems ahead, we should put everything on the table. Carbon capture, for example, and storage is at the moment just too expensive, but perhaps in the future it might be feasible. And maybe one of the more controversial possibilities, which we do not deal with in this particular report, also is nuclear energy, because that has a very safe historical record. In spite of Fukushima, we know that was a big problem in time. But it's a form of energy that exists. The price keeps coming down, and it's not that high, in fact, according to the recent studies. And it's available. And the hope is that we will, again, with time, develop even safer technologies. But again, the point there with nuclear energy is that it's again the historical fact that it has worked with relatively little problem compared to fossil fuels and other forms of energy.
Yes. And it's again down to this perception of risk.
That's right.
So you find yourself at the forefront of arguments about global climate. As a child, you were a very scientifically interested child, were you not?
That's right. Yes.
What form did your scientific explorations take?
Well, when I was a child, quite young, 10 years old or so, I was already quite interested. I like to read and read biographies of scientists and so on, and then started to play with chemistry sets, microscopes, and I was fascinated with these games, if you want. And so I just continued. It was not something connected to school, but just it was more connected as a hobby.
I like the use of the word games. That was it the tools that you enjoyed? Was it the questions you enjoyed? What was behind it?
It was probably the questions and doing experiments myself. I was lucky when I had an aunt, when my father's sister was a chemist, and after I showed a lot of interest in these things, she helped me do more sophisticated experiments. So to me that was just fascinating to actually see things with my own eyes and do the experiments with my own hands. Okay, and so it's this active learning, which, by the way, is a tendency nowadays to change education quite dramatically, to have kids do these sort of things rather than just memorizing. Okay, and so this natural curiosity that we have as children, just looking through a microscope and suddenly discovering a new world there with all sorts of little creatures moving that you don't see with your naked eyes. Okay, that sort of thing was fascinating to me. Well, I had a number of good teachers that were sympathetic, if you want, to this attitude towards science, and until eventually this could materialize. I had decided as a child, if it was possible to become a scientist and to do scientific research for a living or as a hobby, that's what I wanted to do.
You had your aunt who was influencing you, and your parents were nurturing. They gave you the space you needed.
My parents were nurturing. They were not scientists. My father was a lawyer, but they nurtured it. They gave me they supported my interest.
Yes. And did you ever contemplate any other career?
I did. As a kid, I liked music. I still like it a lot, of course, and I used to play the violin. And so I did contemplate, well, maybe that's an option. I could become a musician. And somehow or other, my parents got some advice that unless I was willing to spend 8 or 10 hours a day just playing the violin, that I should just give it up. And to me, that was very bad advice, because you could, of course, get very involved in music without being a musician. Okay, fortunately, I mean, even though I gave up eventually playing the violin myself, I never gave up my fondness for music. But if I had a chance again, I would not give it up. I would just do it as a hobby. Okay? So I think that was just because I did not get correct advice. Fortunately, that didn't affect at least learning and listening to music.
That's true. You were brought up, in Mexico, but also traveling around?
Yes, actually, as a child, because of this interest I had in the sciences, my parents sent me to Switzerland for a couple of years
to
learn German.
Ah, how old were you?
I was probably 11.
God. Yeah.
So this was just a boarding school, if you want. And it was a very good experience, because, again, my chemistry teacher in Switzerland is somebody I got along very well with and did experiments. The disappointment I had, if you want, which fortunately was not serious, is I thought, now that I'm going to Europe, all my friends will also be like me, and they like science a lot. And they were just like my Mexican friends. Okay? Of course, I had normal friends and played and did things, but my friends at that age did not like anything connected to school. Okay, so Again, in Europe, it was something I did on my own or with my teachers, not with my friends. That happened much later, eventually just in college, or actually when I started college and the PhD. That's when you begin to, of course, share all this interest in science with your colleagues. But as a child, it was very much a lonely activity because, again, of the normal situation that I hope is changing now of children just disliking school and disliking science because it's just memorizing all sorts of facts and very boring.
Yes, the opposite of what it is, really. But
Exactly, yes.
But that does indicate you were quite a precocious child, then, that you were so turned on to science by the age of 11 that you were sent to a school to nurture those interests. That's unusual.
Well, my parents had a sort of tradition. They wanted to send us and my brothers and sisters abroad as young kids to learn another language and to be exposed to another culture. So I was very lucky to be part of that. Yeah. But in my case, of course, very much along the lines, as you just mentioned, of pursuing my interest in science.
You obviously feel very tied to Mexico, and now you divide your time between the United States and Mexico.
That's right. That's right.
Is that a hard balance to manage?
Yeah, well, it is, but for many years, again, when I was, for example, just at MIT, a researcher, then I went to Mexico just for vacations and so on. But at some point, I started to do some work with my MIT colleagues that was connected with air quality in Mexico City, because we wanted to do something very interdisciplinary, not just involving science, but also policy, economics, and so on. And that was remarkably successful because we got our students very interested in this interdisciplinary approach to social problems. Of course, making sure that their basic interest in whatever field they were working remained very strong. Okay? But as a consequence of that, I realized I could, at some stage, that I was going to have more impact or that it was something more satisfactory to do, to go back to Mexico and to really do some work in my country of origin. And of course, I am both a Mexican and an American citizen, and I remain, of course, very much involved with my activities in the United States. The main example perhaps being on this scientific advisory board to President Obama. So I think, fortunately for these issues I work with, they are very much international in scope, so it's both to Mexico's and the United States' interest to have this international perspective. So that's what brings it all together. Take this climate change approach, even though we're focusing it to begin with in the United States, it's something we can expand to Mexico and Latin America as well. But in Mexico, it's really a change in field from science to science policy. The big challenge is how can we change not just regulations and so on, but how can we actually affect the way society functions? It's a big challenge, but we've been able to manage in some cases, like improving air quality in Mexico City and so on. But yes, it is a challenge indeed.
Is it a model you can export to other cities, the successful way you've tackled it in Mexico City?
Yes. And in fact, we work closely with all the cities, beginning with Latin America. We had some projects where we were simultaneously working also with Bogota, Santiago in Chile, and so on, and Sao Paulo in Brazil. And so we have a lot to learn from each other. But again, there are other examples, other cities, not just in Latin America. And that's beginning to happen. There's a lot of effort. There are associations of cities now, for example, dealing with the climate change issue. But in broader terms, in terms of improving the quality of life greener cities where transportation works efficiently, and so on and so forth. So this is an international effort that I think is beginning to take form and becoming stronger and stronger, learning from each other what works.
The collaborative approach that sort of powers science, but expanded to encompass everybody. Yes,
that's right.
So
and it's a challenge because you have to deal with society that is hard to change. But if you find the right leaders, then we think it can be moved.
So it seems to me that in many ways you have transitioned, really, talking of the word leader, from being a practicing scientist to almost a sort of scientific leader. Well, first question, do you miss the science, or are you so busy leading that you don't miss it? You don't have time?
Well, I do miss it. Of course, I was very much involved very early on doing experiments myself, but then later, when I'm having a large group, the experiments were actually carried out by my students. But now, the way I looked at it is even though I missed, if you want, being heavily involved in just fundamental science or even applied science, but with a group of students, many of my former students are doing excellent science now as faculties in very well-known universities and so on. So in some sense, I feel that I was able to keep that going. And I can do something that has more impact and, in some sense, a larger challenge to this translation of science into policy, which is there are relatively few scientists do successfully. Okay? And it's something we have to educate our students more and more with. So that's one component is this policy aspect, but the other one is education also, just making sure that the educational system keeps evolving and changing to become more and more effective.
It's a very important point that on both counts, and I suppose, as we were saying earlier, the idea that there is so little science in the political system just argues that there needs to be a greater cohort of scientists who want to be involved in politics.
That's right.
And policy.
Sure. I agree. Yeah.
Last question. Do you yourself think that at some point you might actually enter politics full time?
No, I had that option some time ago already, just perhaps because of, having a Nobel Prize gives you all sorts of opportunities if you want, and a few of my colleagues have done that. But no, I decided that was not the way I could function best, and I could probably have more impact, do things in a more important fashion, remaining outside politics, but stressing this connection between science and policy. It's a different world if you really become a secretary of energy or whatever. Then there are so many other pressures, or secretary of the environment, it's just I decided that was not the way I would be most productive.
Well, it's been absolutely splendid speaking to you. Thank you very much indeed for giving me your time.
Well, I'm pleased to do that, sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bon voyage.
This podcast was presented by Nobel Prize Conversations. If you'd like to learn more about Mario Molina, you can go to nobelprize.org, where you'll find a wealth of information about the prizes and the people behind the discoveries. Nobel Prize Conversations is a podcast series with Adam Smith, a co-production of Filt and Nobel Prize Outreach. The producer for Nobel Prize Talks was Magnus Cillier. The editorial team for this Encore production includes Andrew Hart, Olivia Lundquist, and me, Claire Brilliant. Music by Epidemic Sound. You can find previous seasons and conversations on Acast or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.